What's up? This is Dr. Taylor Krick at the Washington Wellness Center, and this is our next video in our whiteboard series. These are things that I commonly draw for patients in their consultations. So I'm very visual and I do a lot of drawings for people. And so we're doing a series of just the videos of those to just understand and explain the mechanisms of what make people chronically ill today. This one is really one of my favorites. It is what I've spent the last long time studying, so especially this year due to some of my own health concerns. I've been taking an immunology course. I've done hundreds of hours of understanding this immunology, which is very, very complex and complicated, but I think that I've got a grasp of it enough now after a year or so of now I can kind of break it down and explain how some of this stuff happens. We have some other videos explaining these mechanisms a lot deeper, so longer videos explaining these mechanisms and kind of the vicious cycles between them. But what we're talking about here is adaptive immunity. So we see a lot of autoimmune stuff, we see a lot of allergies and stuff like that too. Of course, that's all adaptive, your adaptive immune system. So I'm not going to get into all the nuances of innate versus adaptive, but what we're looking at here is what's called T-cell polarization. And there are many other T-cell subgroups that we're not talking about in this video, but really talking about the two main ones being what's called T helper cell 1 and T helper cell 2. And we've drawn them behind me on this teeter-totter because what happens is that your naive T cells can either become one thing or another. They can't be more than one. So it's like your kids, as they're growing up, they can be a doctor or a lawyer or a cop or a criminal, and they can maybe be all, a couple of those things. But for the most part, you got to kind of pick one thing. And for T cells, you for sure got to, pick one thing. But so you can't, as more become Th2s, less become Th1s, or vice versa. And what happens is over time, chronically, you want your immune system to more than teeter-totter. You want it to be more like a pendulum of it goes back and forth. Like it goes to Th1 if you get sick, and then it goes back to Th2 if you get, something else. But you don't want it to get stuck in one side or the other. What happens with autoimmune cases, with just chronic, gut dysbiosis and stress and exposure to molds and different things, over time, many people become what's called Th2 polarized. So let's talk about that. So this side of the teeter-totter goes up, right? So you start to get more of these symptoms. So some of the Th2 related symptoms, well, they're things like asthma, allergies. So if somebody comes in and on their paperwork I see Zyrtec and Claritin, I'm putting a star by that of that's a first sign that somebody's Th2 polarized. And we got to figure out, kind of why, or if they're autoimmune, or, because Th2 can lead to autoimmunity and autoimmunity can lead to Th2. There's a lot of vicious cycles involved with this immunology. But allergies, that also includes, not true IgE allergies, but IgG and sensitivities. So some people have food sensitivities, or they're sensitive to their environment, or they walk in, they're stuck in an elevator with somebody with a perfume or a cologne, and it's like giving them headaches or anxiety. So sensitivities too is more of this Th2 sign. And then it's inflammation in hollow spaces. So the sinuses, very, very common. One of my major complaints, if not, my only complaint really, but like sinus inflammation all the time. That's a Th2 sign for sure. Gut inflammation, overgrowths. I put SIBO in here because we can have overgrowths like sinus infections, opportunistic overgrowth, or candida or yeast or SIBO overgrowths of the gut. So these overgrowths, these opportunistic infections, create this inflammation in hollow spaces. So sinus inflammation, gut, bladder infections, urinary tract infections, lung infections, or just lung inflammation. These are all signs of Th2 dominance. Upper respiratory infections. So somebody that's getting sick all the time, and we're going to talk about the other side of the teeter-totter too, but somebody that keeps getting chronic sinus infections. And for me growing up, I had sinus infections all the time. My parents remember, I remember you being home for weeks at a time. And there's all kinds of things that I'll get into with my own history about that. But a history of sinus infections, a history of urinary tract infections, a history of ear infections lead me to believe that there's Th2 dominance. As that side tips up, Th1 tips down. Th1 fights things like intracellular infections. So as this side goes down, it leaves you more prone to something like a viral activation of like an Epstein-Barr virus, or you get even an influenza virus or a COVID virus, or HSV, you get a cold sore. I have some issues with this, and I never had a cold sore in my life until a year ago, but to me that's a sign on the outside, it's at least easy to see that there's some viral reactivation. It's like, why is my Th1 side down, leaving me more susceptible to this? These viruses too, they're smart, so they have immune evading mechanisms that they do this. They'll dampen Th1 because they don't want to be caught and killed. So as you get more viruses, you get more Th1 going down, and as you get more overgrowth, you get more Th2 going up. So this is a vicious cycle. And once again, we have a whole video going through the vicious cycle of infections and overgrowth. But so once again, Epstein-Barr virus, any herpetic virus, cytomegalovirus, chickenpox, Coxsackie virus, etc., or any bacterial infections like Lyme or like a strep infection, or anything along those lines. So this is a really tricky thing, but it's something that we see all the time. And somebody will come in and they'll say, I have X, Y, and Z symptom, and I get sinus infections, and I take, and what happens a lot of times, you get a sinus infection, you take an antibiotic, let's say, and it kills off the bacteria. A lot of times this is fungal. That's what we're finding now is sinusitis. Over 90% of it has a fungal component, and there's often a bacterial component too, but the antibiotic doesn't do anything for the fungus. So the yeast continues to grow in your gut or in your sinuses, drives more Th2 inflammation. Th2 is a self-reinforcing loop, meaning that the more cells become Th2, the more they encourage other T cells to also become Th2, and it just keeps going and going and going. So anyway, I don't want to get too deep into this. We have another video explaining it, but this is one of my favorite drawings to know that sometimes what we have to do is we have to lower this side. That's our number one priority. If somebody comes in with an asthma attack or with allergies, we have to lower that side. If somebody is chronically getting infections, sometimes we have to raise this side. Sometimes we have to do both. Sometimes we have to go in with things that are more like cinder blocks that we can set on this teeter-totter and bring balance with things like vitamin D or glutathione, which both have a little impact on the teeter-totter, but overall promote tolerance or promote balance of the teeter-totter. So when you understand this mechanism, you understand a lot of the approaches that we take. Now, one last thing, that's a big one. What caused it in the first place? I mean, you have to know that. So one of the things that can drive this, parasites. Parasites are a known driver of this. Another one is allergies. And once again, going back to the mold, that's a really common one that we very rarely run a mold test that doesn't show that somebody's off the charts or have mold or mycotoxins. And then it's a whole, Pandora's box of, is it in your house? Is it colonized in your sinuses? Is it colonized in your gut? So you're carrying the problem around with you at all times? Or what is driving this Th2 dominance? Or what is suppressing the Th1 response? And how do we begin to modulate that? We've got different symptom surveys. We've got a variety of things to try to measure this. It's really hard to measure on labs, to do like a cytokine profile or a T and B cell lymphocyte profile is expensive. We do them occasionally, but they're not cheap. So we base it on symptomatology and how somebody is responding. But this is the target of a lot of our approaches. Now, there are other things that have to be addressed. If there's an overgrowth, if there's slow motility, if there's bad digestion, if there's just a lot of inflammation, if there's a lot of what's called Th17, which is tissue damaging inflammation. There's a lot that goes into this. That's not for you to know, that's for me to know. But just know that sometimes if you've got allergies, asthma, sinuses, gut, you also get bladder infections, urinary tract infections, yeast infections, and you also maybe get cold sores and etc. Your teeter-totter is really, really out of whack. If you get a fraction of those things, your teeter-totter might just be a little bit out of whack. But we see this all the time, that the immune system is imbalanced, and it leads to an increase in some symptoms, a decrease in other functions, which altogether leads to an increase of all these symptoms, and it's a vicious cycle. So part of our goal is to try to stop that vicious cycle so it's not something that you're dealing with for the rest of your life.